When you move to the Philippines, one of the key questions you'll have is, what's it going to cost to live my life here? There's plenty of videos where a YouTuber will show their cost of living, and that's a start. It gives you some examples, and you can roughly estimate your own costs based on that. Sometimes, if the costs they present are sensibly organized, entirely represented, reliably tracked, averaged over time, and adjustable to your lifestyle. So what does all that mean? Let's look at each of those. In the previous video, we talked about 8 categories of expenses, 6 of these covering recurring monthly expenses. These represent your normal living expenses. The other 2 categories represent extra expenses you'll likely incur and so should be taken into account. If you haven't watched that video, I'll provide a link to it here. It provides a detailed breakdown of all expenses you may encounter and gives the rationale for organizing them into these 8 categories. But don't worry, you can watch that video later to get the details. For now, just trust that these categories make sense. In this video, we'll apply some real numbers to each of these 8 categories to show how much money you'll spend in each. Many folks start out with a budget that covers most expenses we can think of off the top of our heads. But they may neglect to add occasional expenses like visa fees, one-time purchases, and travel, because these don't fit neatly in a monthly budget. We tend to think in terms of recurring monthly expenses, but neglected expenses can represent a significant portion of the total cost of living here, as we'll see when we dig into the numbers. And if a YouTuber wasn't being strict about big expenses, then what about all those little ad hoc expenses, like an extra coffee or a night out drinking with the guys? Those add up. You need to have buckets to budget and track those extra expenses. And speaking of tracking expenses, I've got nearly 3 years of detailed expense tracking data from my time living in Southeast Asia, including 2 full calendar years, 2017 and 2018, in the Philippines. And this data reveals not just the absolute amounts I spent, but also the percentages of my total budget that went into each category. And that can inform your own estimates for expenses. You'll be able to plug your total budget number in and see it automatically allocate that money across all 8 categories. Because one month doesn't tell the tale. There's plenty of videos with titles like my January cost of living or whatnot. But a single month doesn't capture the full picture. If the person presenting the data didn't travel that month, then that's an occasional expense that isn't represented. The data I use is averaged over 2 years and converted against the average exchange rate to the US dollar. You can easily convert these values to any other currency, euros, pounds, Australian dollars, by changing just a couple cells in the spreadsheet I'll provide. Finally, the costs presented in budget videos should be adjustable to your lifestyle. Within those 8 categories, there are good indicators of overall lifestyle costs, which means we've got a model we can use to estimate how much you should allocate to rent, dining out, travel, and other expenses based on your specific budget total, the total amount you can afford or want to spend. That will give you a pretty good idea of what kind of lifestyle you can have in the Philippines. And you can also adjust the percentages if you don't think mine makes sense in some categories. So let's dig in. I promise I've made this easy. Here's the model, and here's the data. And here's what you get when you mash them up. My normal monthly expenses averaged about $1,650 per month for the 2 years of data used in this model. But there are always extra expenses. As you recall, these get put into the one-time expenses and travel expenses categories. And for me, these added 19% and 13% to my overall spending. In the one-time category, 2 motorcycles, a new computer, an iPhone, an Apple TV, clothes, sheets, towels, and other apartment stuff all added up to more than $300 extra each month. I averaged over $200 each month on travel. I didn't travel every month, but took about a dozen trips around the Philippines during those 2 years. So we can see how adding these occasional extra expenses shows your true cost of living. Back on the recurring costs, rent is typically the biggest, and combined with other household expenses like electric, internet, and items like visa fees I include in this category, my total household expenses amounted to about 47% of my normal monthly expenses. Rent can imply lifestyle, and many other expenses rise or fall with rent, up to a point. If you live in a more expensive location, you probably also eat in more expensive restaurants and partake in more expensive activities. None of this is an exact science, and each of us has different wants, needs, and tolerances. So it's important to adjust your estimates based on your situation and preferences. But you need a place to start from, and this is at least real data that's been carefully organized and collected. And that's the reason I break out the two extra expense categories in this model. You can use this spreadsheet to goal seek based on your normal monthly budget to see what you can afford for rent, dining out, etc. And then set your own estimates of how much on top of that you might spend in the more discretionary extras categories. In fact, you can adjust the percentages in this spreadsheet for any of the 8 categories. If you aren't dating, if you're already married, you can reduce or eliminate that expense. Maybe you're only providing support to the family and absorbing all other related expenses in the other categories. You spend a bit more on groceries or dining out with a live-in girlfriend or wife, so you can increase your estimates in those categories. But my data already reflects an active dating life, punctuated by periods when I had a steady girl. I might have been over-generous in providing direct support to each girl or her family, so it might make sense to reduce your allocation to that category. I had a bike. Getting around was cheap apart from the one-time expense of the bike itself, so maybe you will want to shift the allocation reduction from the girlfriend category into your transportation category. Notice when you change any allocation percentage. The spreadsheet indicates whether you've pushed the number under budget or over budget. In this case, we removed 6% from the girlfriend support category, so we're now showing total allocation of 94% in the budget. That's 6% you can allocate somewhere else, and in this case, we'll add it to the transportation category, taking that from 2% to 8% of our budget, and that sets us back to 100% allocated. See how that works? The model is flexible, but gives you a starting point based on real data. Let's take another look at how you can use a range of budget amounts to explore the data. By setting a range around your target budget, you can see how the numbers change on either side of your target. Let's say your target is $1,200 a month. There it is. But you know there will be some extra expenses along the way you'll want to account for. And if your total including those expenses has to remain around $1,200, now you can look at what that implies for your normal living expenses. Looking at the grand total line, we can scan across and find where it equals our 1,200 target. Highlighting that column, we can see what that implies for your normal living expenses. In this case, you're going to have to keep those to about $1,050. And the spreadsheet then shows you what that implies for how much you can spend on rent and other expenses. And that tells you a lot about the lifestyle you'll have when you get here. How much you can realistically spend on rent, dining out, and other expenses. That helps when you go online looking for a condo or house to rent, and also informs whether you'll be near the top of the rental market in an area, or nearer the bottom, in which case you may want to investigate other options. Maybe less dining out, more on groceries, freeing up some extra to afford higher rent. I invite you to continue exploring this budget seeking and planning model on your own. There's a link to the spreadsheet below in the description for this video. Download it and explore it, and let me know in the comments if you find it helpful or informative. And if you find these videos thought-provoking and informative, click on that subscribe button to keep up to date as new videos are added. And you can share this stuff too. Your friends will think you're smart. Thanks for watching.